Hello and welcome to the latest video in our poetry review, and what we're looking at today is, in our video lesson, is the poem Dulce et Decorum by Wilfred Owen. Now this follows on nicely from our last one, which was also a World War I poem by Siegfried Sassoon, which was Base Details. Now again, for this we're going to teach you how to analyse, how to read and appreciate the poem, and crucially for students, how to answer it properly in terms of poetic technique, themes, tone, imagery and language that is used. As well as that, to help aid our appreciation, help aid the quality of our answers, we're going to look at the background of Wilfred Owen and how that shaped his writing and shaped his personal experiences, which, like Sassoon, is very, very literal because he served in World War I himself. Now, like every deep dive, we're going to start with a reading of the poem itself. And for the purpose of this presentation, because it is a bigger poem than the ones we've normally done, we're going to break it down into stanza by stanza. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched to sleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys, in ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone was still yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes riding in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt blood come gurgling from the corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, Dulce et Decorum est pro patria mori. Now, to analyse this, we have to go back to the very title of the poem itself. So, we know it's a poem written by Wilfred Owen during World War I, and it was written sometime, like all of Wilfred Owen's work, between August 17 and September 1918, while he's fighting for the First World War. Now, it's quite an interesting poem that he has here, because it's in Latin, okay? So the Latin title is actually taken from a famous Latin phrase by the Roman poet who's called Horace. And what Horace says in his one is Dulce et Decorum est pro patria mori, as we see in the likes at the end of the poem. Now, what that translates for, Dulce et Decorum est, it is sweet and it is fitting to die for one's country. So it's this idea of dying gives you that duty, gives you that sense of you're doing right, that it's the honourable thing to do. When in reality, as both Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon say, it's quite the opposite. That your life is stolen. So, pro patria mori, Dulce et Decorum est, it's again that idea by going back to Latin, going back to Romans, that it's this right, that it's this honourable thing, that it's been done for years. Now, what you'll see is when you're looking at the poem in front of you, whether you have it in a book or whether you Google it online, it's broken down into 4 parts, 4 stanzas, but essentially what the poem is, it's 2 sonnets. So it's a 28-line poem, and it's split up into 2 14-line poems. So anyone who studies Shakespeare or does Renaissance history will see that a sonnet is a 14-line poem. But the stanzas are broken up quite differently because it's irregular. So you see you have stanza 1 here, you have stanza 2, then you have it broken up in the middle of stanza 3 with just a 2-line stanza before stanza 4 becomes the longest of the bunch. So, but we have to look at this into how it had Wilfred Owen. And with Wilfred Owen, what you can always talk about is how there's a tragedy to his poems when we know his outcome, which we'll come to a bit later on. But to the explanation of this poem, and when we're reading it, drafts of the poem were dedicated to another poet called Jesse Pope, who wrote about war propaganda, but this was later removed from all the other copies. Now, the thing about this title, Dulce Decorum Est, like Base Details, it's an ironic title. It's ironic because its intended meaning is the opposite of what it literally is. So it's literally the opposite of being sweet and fitting to die for your country. The use of Latin, as we said, reflects this classical education of the wealthier classes at the time and indicates that the audience Owen is writing for are well-educated Brits who supported the war in Europe. But again, it's an attack on the educated officer class who glorify this war, who think it's the best thing to do, who were involved in the decision making, but ultimately aren't going to be the ones who are going to die in the front line. So, before we go into the poem then, let's talk about Wilfred Owen. So, Wilfred Owen lived from 1893 to 1918. And looking at this, what you will see is quite a young man when he died. He was only 25. And again, when you're looking at this, 1918 was when World War One ended. And there's a tragedy to that we're going to look at a bit later. But Wilfred Owen was a British poet and soldier, and he's regarded by many as the leading poet of the First World War. Now, he was influenced by his friend Siegfried Sassoon, and what we do know is that they did meet up, both in Britain, and that they corresponded in the war. And what Owen and Sassoon wrote was in a stark contrast to both how the public saw war, what their perception was of it at the time, what the newspapers were writing of it. And it's also a stark contrast to the types of poems that were written about the war before Sassoon and Owen came along. So let's look at it this way now. Go back to stanza 1. Owen is known for his wrenching descriptions of suffering in war. And in Dulce and Decorum Est, he illustrates the brutal, everyday struggle of a group of soldiers. And he's focusing, rather ironically, on the story of one soldier's agonising death. And, as you can see, it's run-on lines, lack of full stops, that it all seems to overwhelm your senses. And that's purposely done because not only do we feel the death, but we also feel the trauma of the soldiers who are left behind. And again, the use of the quote from the poet Horace shows, this contrast that war isn't glorious and that actually there's a horrifying reality to it, and this reality isn't spoken about often enough. So, the speaker begins with this description of soldiers bent over with the weight of their backpacks, like old beggars under sacks. So again, we're already looking here at this lack of dignity. That they're not being treated like human beings. Their knees are unsteady. Here at knock-kneed. So they can barely stand. They're weary. They're tired. They've been marching for ages. They're coughing like poor and sick hags, old women. So look, again, there's no dignity here. Beggars, hags, broken down old women. And they're struggling, cursed, as he said. No, instead of struggling, he says cursed. Like they're being punished through sludge, through this muddy landscape. They turn away from the haunting flares. So what happened here was this was an old German tactic of flares, where the Germans used to send flares into the sky, which would not light up the night sky in the dark areas in order to try and see and spot British soldiers and kill them. So think of this first edition of radar, or first edition of UAV if you play Call of Duty, and it allowed them to begin their march towards the distant camp. But these men are so tired, and it seems impossible. Distant rest, men marched to sleep. In a way, they were almost robotic. That they weren't human, they were just going through the motions. Many lost their combat boots, yet continued on despite their bare and their bleeding feet even. The soldiers are so worn out, they're essentially disabled. They can't see anything at all. They're tired to the point of feeling drunk, like they don't have all their senses around them, and they don't even notice the sound, unfortunately, and crucially, of the dangerous poison gas shells that are dropping just behind them. So it's fatal here. Then we look at stanza 2, and all of a sudden, it wakes us up. So men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. So these long run-on lines and elongated vowels is to make you feel asleep, to lure you into a false sense of security that you're going through the motions as well. Then stanza 2 comes along. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! In ecstasy of fumbling. So somebody all of a sudden cries out with this urgency. And we feel the danger here all of a sudden. Now, the soldiers fumble with their gas masks and they get them on just in time. One man, however, unfortunately, is yelling out and struggling and he can't get his mask on. Okay, so this proves fatal that he can't use his gas mask. The clouds are closing in. The circle's closing on him. Now, the speaker describes this man as looking like someone caught in fire or lime. And lime would have been, again, going back to the Romans as well, an ancient sort of chemical weapon used to effectively blind their opponents. The speaker then compares the scene through the panes of his gas mask with poison gas filling the air. So this is, he's looking at it from his gas mask. The thick green light, the poisonous green light filling the air. And he compares it to drowning, to being underwater. And that's how he imagines what's happening to a soldier. Same way as he's drowning, his lungs are filling. He can't breathe, and unfortunately it results in his death. So then what happens, the speaker jumps from the past tense, jumps from talking about the past attack to a present moment sometimes afterwards. Okay, so now we're in the next part. And he describes a recurring dream that he can't escape. So like Sassoon, we have this idea of post-traumatic stress. It backs up this point that even those who did survive never came back the same. The horrors they witnessed and the horrors that they had seen had never been seen in any war before this. World War I was a complete game changer. So he suggests that if the readers could experience their own suffocating dreams marching behind this wagon in which the other men have placed the dying soldier, or if they had been seeing the riding of the dying soldier's eyes in his face and hearing him cough up this blood from his ruined lungs at every bump in the path. So even though he's lifeless, that all this blood, everything that had accumulated in his lungs, is still being knocked out as they're hitting the bumpy path. Like a devil sick of sin, the jolt. And even the word jolt, that you associate with electricity, with lightning, is to shock us at every stage. It's a sight that the speaker compares to something as horrible and something as unfortunately relatable as cancer and other diseases that ravage even the innocent. So the fact that it's cancer, not only is he talking about the brutality here, but he's talking about, again, like all the other themes you'd see with a lot of these war boats, the injustice and the unfairness of it. The tragedy of it. How it doesn't discriminate, how it doesn't choose man or woman or child or anything like that. And again, the lies. He's saying that you glorify these soldiers, that you have this high zest. You tell children about the idea of being soldiers, why it's good to fight for your country. And that old lie, that's the key word here, Dulce et Decorum lest, pro patria mori. And again, he says how old the lie is by referring to the idea of Latin. Now, the themes of this poem. Okay, so Wilfred Owen wrote this poem, Dulce et Decorum, while he was fighting as a soldier during World War I. The poem is graphic. The poem is also bitter. And it describes the horrors of that war in particular, although it also speaks of the horror of all wars in general. And it's easy to comment on the horror of war, but the poem's depiction of this is devastating because it's so specific, because it's so relatable, because it tells us every minor detail. And it shows us that, from Wilfred Owen's point of view, that the soldier's in excruciating pain, that he's dying, and that this daily horror is a regular thing, that it's not extraordinary, that it's something that they get used to. Okay? So we have the brutality of death. Now it's a constant. what we also have here is we're looking at the injustice of war. And again, what you might do if you're doing a longer essay or a longer poem, depending on your question, you can absolutely tie this in with what Sassoon says in base details. The way Owen uses his language to put readers inside the experience of a soldier helps them to understand and begin to empathise with the horrific experience of all these awful aspects of war. But we go back to that first stanza just to reiterate the point of the theme. Okay? The speaker throws us into this, mundane, everyday experience that they have. Drudging, struggling through the mud. Suffering is a constant. As the regiment or as the speaker's group walks from the front lines back to a place that we only know as distant rest. So it's miles away. The fact that he doesn't refer to a specific place, again, isn't accidental. It just seems impossible for him to reach any place of rest when you're in the middle of war. This is not a portrait of men, who have any ideals or who see the heroicism in this battle or are driven by war or money or greed or anything like that. Instead, they're miserable. They're coughing like hags. They're cursing themselves as they trudge through the sludge. Okay? Their feet are bloody. They're marching half asleep. It's like being drunk. They're suggesting these soldiers are kind of a living dead. In a way, they're zombies. Physically, they look like zombies, but mentally, their humanity has been taken from them, is what he means here by this. They're the living dead. The terror and its brutality have just deadened them. Or to put another way, they're dead inside now. So, the speaker is very clear here, and Owen in this case is very clear, that the life of a soldier is very painful. It's very demoralising. It changes you. You're never the same again. And he shows this brutality and this life-changing moment, or this life-changing moment in a way, in stanza 2. It moves from describing the communal we of the regiment and what everyone faces together to the specific dying man. It's this idea that death in war is also terrible. It's barbaric. It's agonising. It's meaningless. In these first two lines that we see here, it captures the terror and the confusion that you would face of a gas attack. And this gas attack, again, was a new feature in World War I combat and had never been seen to the extent that it was seen before this war. And the movement from the first cry of gas here, okay, to then it's all of a sudden being amplified in block capitals as gas, which is then followed by all the men fumbling. They're confused. They don't know what to do with their clumsy helmets. That these helmets aren't fit for purpose. The speaker then describes this man who unfortunately makes a fatal mistake as he's stumbling and he's floundering. So this rhyming like a man in the fire, and this, unfortunate for the poet and for the speaker, he can only watch helplessly from with his own mask. So it's this idea, if even that you're safe, death is constantly around you. That it could have so easily been someone else who was in that war. And this other soldier's death is just full of confusion and pain. Another irony, there isn't an enemy to face. It's this physically agonising death, again, due to the decision making of those scarlet majors that you see in base details. So the very short third stanza then is the one that people look at and ask, why is it so short? But it's plunged us back into the speaker's own mind. And that's the key thing here. So it takes a brief interlude. It's like a sidebar in a way. In doing so, this poem reveals another aspect of the horror of war. That even surviving war offers you future torment. That once the war is over on the battlefield, it's not necessarily over in your mind. That the surviving speaker and all the survivors in a way describes themselves as having these dreams. Okay? Of course, he's ironic there with the term dreams. They're actually nightmares. You can't escape this vision. It means he can't ever achieve the rest, which was the one positive thing that they wanted in the first stanza. Okay? This rest, their only respite, their only thing, can't help because he's haunted by these nightmares. And again, saying dreams instead of nightmares isn't accidental. It's again another category of satire that you see in this war poetry. The speaker's sleep is permanently haunted by the trauma of the death he has witnessed. So in a way, those who live and survive suffer nearly as badly, if not worse, than those who died. And since the third stanza is written in this present tense, it indicates that it will never fade. The poem's portrayal is of the horror of war, that is complete and total. It reveals all aspects of war to us, living through it, dying in it, and surviving it, as it's being brutal, agonising, and it's without meaning. And another idea that the team tells us, which is nonsense, is the idea that war is glorious. And it tells us that that is nothing more than a myth. Okay? Because in the first three stanzas of Dulce et Decorum Est, it presents a vision of war, and World War One in this case, that's entirely brutal, it's bitter, it's pessimistic. But this fourth and final stanza here marks a shift. We see a dramatic change. While the first stanza focuses on the we of the group. So look at this, we have we. So we're talking about the regiment. The second stanza was about the he of the dying soldier. The third stanza was the I of the speaker. And now the fourth stanza is focused on you as the reader. In this stanza, speakers and that person that has survived the war is directly addressing you. He's trying to make you understand the brutal reality of war. This is an effort to contradict that old lie. The stuff that was sold in the media at the time, and it was sold in the adverts and the war propaganda to those who went away. The commonly held belief from Horace that war and dying in war is meaningful and full of glory. It's also possible, guys, if you want to explore this in your answers and want to go down this route, to read this last stanza in a hopeful way. So in a poem of death and destruction, you can take hope from it. Like all poems, you read into it. There's never been a set of answers provided by Owen, but all poems you can interpret your own way, just like any poem or any song lyric, once you can back it up. And the evidence to show that's a hopeful way by imagining that this poem effectively communicates to non-soldiers and those who weren't there the brutality of the war and how it's futile and how it's not worth it. In this view, Owen wrote the poem with the belief that by highlighting the juxtaposition, and it's a lovely term that we're putting up here, juxtaposition. And what's juxtaposed here is the idea of this honourable death that's been around since the time of Horace, Dulce et Decorum Est, or versus the reality, which is the messy, nasty, horrifying, and I suppose crucially here, truth of war. So there's this juxtaposition. This juxtaposition is when two ideas directly oppose one another. And perhaps then through this juxtaposition that the poem's audience will change its attitude towards war and won't just cheerfully send its men off and its young men and its hope and its future, or in a lot of the cases in World War I, children, to die in agony. So if, by reading this poem in a hopeful way, however, requires you as the reader to believe that empathy is enough to change our central beliefs. And empathy is a key issue here. This is a plausible reading, it's a believable reading, but it hinges on using the descriptions of the speaker and telling us and explaining to any examiner, to any analyst, or anyone who's reading your answers about how disturbing and how evocative enough it is to show what Owen describes as a sentimental belief, and that war isn't sentimental. that despite what was happening in ancient history and what everyone says, war isn't glorious. Now, it's a difficult thing to do in one short poem, no matter how powerful the language is, but it is possible. And taking this in mind, and by keeping this in mind, it's perhaps the more you read into this poem and reading it more carefully that you can interpret this final stanza with a degree of pessimism too. You see, it's all up to you how you want to analyse this. In this reading, while you might still agree that Owen wrote the poem in hopes of changing minds, the speaker could also be pessimistic maybe. And this is up to your own personal beliefs and your own reading. You decide, guys. He's ultimately pessimistic about his ability to change the public's attitude towards war. As the speaker put it, if, and the if is a key word here because it's all conditional. If the audience could experience the trauma he describes, things like the white eyes riding, or the gargling from the fraught, corrupted lungs that we have here as well, that perhaps they wouldn't be so patriotic and they wouldn't be passing these ideas that war is great and fighting and dying for your country is great, that they wouldn't pass these ideas down to the children. But then again, because they don't experience it, they can't live it and they can't possibly realise it, except through reading this poem. And this poem shows how desperate that Owen can be writing this, and that even perhaps Wilfred Owen realises at times that language isn't enough. Because in the final two lines again, and no matter what tact you're taking here in Dulce and Decorum, it all relates down to the final two lines. It talks about this whole line. And first and simply, the speaker allows Horace to have the final word. The speaker, undermines the words of Horace by calling them a lie, but that description comes before the Latin text. The fact that the words of Horace end the poem, that some other poet's words end his own poem, shows that Horace's words and the belief in the glory and the honour of war outweighs the vision of horror in this poem. So the fact that it's been around so long as a vision and an ideal, unfortunately outweighs what Owen was looking at. But then, quoting a Latin line from Romans, and from Horace in this case, the speaker makes it clear that the depiction of war as glorious, it's not just a misconception by those unfamiliar with war. It's a lie. Okay? It's a lie that's told on purpose. And it's a lie that unfortunately has been told for thousands of years in order to inspire these young men to willingly give their lives to serve the politics and politicians of their countries. So, by looking at it that way, unfortunately, Dulce and Decorum is not then simply trying to reveal the horror of war to the public, but it also condemns history. It's giving out about the politicians who make these decisions, the leaders who make these decisions, and sent not just the thousands who died in World War One, but the millions who died in the course of human history of young men to their deaths based on these tales of glory. The poem demands you that you face the truth and can no longer just go along with the old lie of Dulce et Decorum est. Because if you do that, what the poet is saying is that nothing will ever change, because nothing has ever had before that. Now, just to finish up on, I suppose, again, another irony and another tragedy of this, we know this poem is written sometime around 1917 to 1918. We also know that this poem was first published posthumously in the year 1920. So it's probably something posthumously, guys, means, of course, after death. So, the tragedy here is, we know he died at the age of 25. We know he died in 1918, which is the same year World War One ended, but he died on the 4th of November. So, it's almost like everything Wilfred Owen prophesied about the futility, about the danger, about the needless death, came true in the way of his death himself. Now, Owen himself was injured in 1918 and was treated for shell shock. He went back, he was recovering in England, but either due to a sense of duty or due to being inspired by Wilfrid Sassoon, he returns to war in 1918. And what we know from his death was he was killed in action on the 4th of November during the crossing of Sambury Old Canal, which was exactly 1 week and nearly to the exact hour before the signing of the armistice, which was the treaty that ended the war. And the day after he died, rather, pointlessly, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. The tragedy here is his mother received his death notice on the 11th of November, which was Armistice Day. And she received the death just as the church bells in their town in Shrewsbury in England were ringing out to celebrate the end of the war. Again, read into that as you will, guys, but it does put another layer into this poem that you can use when you're talking about the futility or you're talking about the tragedy of war. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you all again soon.